Welcome to EcoShun's Almost Ultimate Guide to Knitting, where I teach you almost everything you need to know to begin knitting as a beginner. There's a lot to cover in this guide, so let's go ahead and get started. Before you can even get started with learning how to knit, you need to invest in the right materials. There's tons of different materials out there for knitting, but you only need a couple to get started. One of the most important materials in knitting is the yarn. Yarn comes in many different sizes and types, some easier than others to manipulate for beginners. The yarn weight basically tells you how thick the yarn is and can make a project you're working on lightweight or heavy depending on the weight that you choose. Different weights are preferred over others depending on the project you're working on. For an example, if you're making a pair of knit socks, then it would be preferred to use a fingering weight or a weight 1 yarn. The yarn weight is usually always on the back of the yarn label. I personally recommend to start with a weight 5 or a weight 6 yarn as a beginner since it's easier to work with. The more you work with yarn, the easier it'll be to tell which weight a yarn is even without looking at the label. A little tip, if you don't have the correct yarn size you want to work with, you can always double the strands of yarn to make the next size up. So if you combine 2 strands of a weight 3 yarn, then you'll end up with the weight 4 yarn. The weights can also differ based on what type of yarn you're using. There are many different types of yarn. The type of yarn refers to the type of fibers used to make the yarn. Here is a quick overview of the different types of fibers. Acrylic yarn is a synthetic yarn that is easily accessible and includes many different color options. It's great if you're someone who has sensitive skin or allergies, and it's budget friendly. The downsides are that it is synthetic, so it isn't environmentally sustainable, and it isn't a breathable fiber, so it'll hold in odors a lot faster than the other fibers. On the plus side, it is machine washable. Some brands I recommend are Pink Box Yarns, Impeccable, and Lion Brand. Wool is a fiber that comes from sheep that consists of many different options like mohair, merino, alpaca, and more. It's more sustainable than acrylic and is a natural fiber, however it is itchy depending on the wool you choose and a potential allergen if you have an allergy to lanolin, which is a wax secretion from sheepskin. Since it does come from animals, it's not vegan friendly, however there are many ethical brands like Wool and the Gang, We Are Knitters, Malabrigo, Loopy Mango, and more that I highly recommend if you're able to afford it. There are also specific certifications on some wool brands that let you know the sheep has been taken care of properly when getting sheared if you're someone who cares about animal welfare. Cotton is another natural fiber that is more breathable, especially for summertime. Cotton yarn does come in a smaller size, however, which makes it a lot more expensive for larger projects. Some brands I recommend are Peaches and Cream, Mila Mila, and Paint Box Yarns. Other types of fibers include hemp, bamboo, polyester, raffia, silk, linen, nylon, and more. There are also yarn types that combine one or more fibers, like a wool and acrylic blend, a silk and mohair blend, or a bamboo and cotton blend. The next incredibly important material for knitting are a pair of knitting needles. Knitting needles will let you actually manipulate the yarn into the project of your dreams. There are many different needle sizes, which can get a bit confusing, but the best way to know which needle size to use is to refer to the label on the yarn you choose. The yarn majority of the time will have a symbol like this one on the label that tells you the best sizes suitable for working with that yarn in particular. Here is a chart with the different needle sizes as well as suitable projects for the sizes as well. I usually just use the metric system to read my knitting needle sizes. There's also different types of knitting needles. Straight needles are the type of needles that you'd usually see in movies or photos of knitting. I recommend these needles if you're just starting out as they're the cheapest and easiest to get used to. Straight needles are also great for flat projects like blankets, washcloths, and more. Circular needles are my personal favorite. They're needles that are attached to a cord that can come in a variety of different sizes. There are circular needles that are set with their cord, and some can be switched to a different cord size, which are called interchangeable needles. You can buy a set of interchangeable needles for a variety of prices that depend on if the needles are made of a certain material, which we'll get into soon. With circular needles, you can make a variety of projects from hats, sweaters, scarves, and even flat projects like blankets and washcloths. Double-pointed needles are needles typically used to work on smaller projects like socks, gloves, hats, or even knitted plushies. Typically, double-pointed needles come in a set of 5 to 6 needles. Cable needles are used to make cables and knitting projects. Their shape makes it easy for you to slip your stitches onto the cable needle and keep them separate from the project until you're ready to work on them. I go more in depth with cable needles later in the tutorial section of this guide. Knitting needles come in different types of materials, each of which can change your knitting experience. Here, I'll go over the 2 most popular types of knitting needles. Wooden needles I think are perfect for beginners since they hold on to the stitches well and allow better grip and control over your knitting. Metal needles are great if you're someone who's used to knitting and likes to work quickly, since the stitches have an easier time slipping off the needles. Since they're lightweight, they can reduce hand fatigue, but it could be frustrating if you're a beginner since they are more slippery than other needle types. If you're going to use my recommendations of what yarn and knitting needles to start practicing with, I recommend starting with a weight 5 or 6 yarn and 8mm or 10mm circular needles. Once you get the hang of knitting with large yarn and needles, then you can downsize to weight 4 yarn and 5mm circular needles. When I first started, I worked with this kit from Amazon, and eventually I received this knitting set from one of my good friends that's better quality, yet it is on the pricier side, so I'd say only invest in more expensive knitting sets if you're serious about knitting. One thing to note is how loose or tight you want the project to end up. For an example, I have this weight 4 yarn. If I want the perfect balance for this yarn, I would choose a 5mm needle, which creates this square that isn't too tight or too loose. If I want a tighter square, I would use 4mm needles or even 3.5mm needles, which creates these squares. And if I want a looser square, I would choose a 6mm, 7mm, or even 8mm needles, depending on how loose I want the squares to be. Larger needles with a small yarn will create loose gaps that can be ideal if you're wanting to make a project that's more spacey, if that makes sense. If you prefer tightly knitted projects, then smaller knitting needles are ideal, but it's all to preference on what you'd want to work with. It's best to create swatches as practice to test out which size needles you like to work with the yarn that you've chosen for your specific project before actually beginning the project. For beginners, I recommend just using the size that the yarn label tells you to, and then once you get the hang of knitting, you can go ahead and spice it up and use whatever size knitting needles you want. Here are some other materials for knitting that I highly recommend. Measuring tape is great for making sure everything is accurate in sizing. Scissors are helpful to cut your yarn and finish up your projects. You can use any scissors you like. Stitch markers are great to mark important places in your projects. These are the stitch markers I use, but if you can't afford to get any, you can honestly use anything that can mark your place, whether it be bobby pins, tied rubber bands, or even small pieces of yarn you can tie in place as well. Lastly, a tapestry needle helps you weave in your ends. Weaving in your ends means making sure the cut ends of your yarn are tied up neatly in your project so that the project won't come undone, but we'll talk more about that later. Now that you have your yarn, your needles, and all the other materials that you need, it's finally time to actually learn how to knit. There are many different methods of knitting, but in this guide, I'll be showing you how to do the English method and the Continental method. For the English knitting method, the yarn that you work with is worked in the right hand by wrapping it over the working needle before creating a stitch. That method is called throwing, since you're throwing the yarn over the needle. For Continental knitting, the yarn that you work with is worked in the left hand by using your index finger to wrap the yarn over the needle before creating a stitch. This method is called picking, since you're picking the yarn with your finger to use to create a stitch. People say that Continental knitting is a lot faster and easier on your wrists due to the fact that you're literally just using your finger to wrap the yarn around the needle, whereas in English knitting, you have to let go of the needle to wrap the yarn around and then pick it back up to finish the stitch. No method is better than the other in my opinion. It depends on which one you prefer. Either way, you have to practice whether it's English or Continental and get used to the method of your choice. It definitely gets easier with time, and learning both is incredibly beneficial. I personally recommend trying out both and seeing which one's best for you. For reference, I've been doing English knitting since I've started, and I've gotten pretty fast with it, so it's the main method I'll be using in this guide. I do have a tutorial on how to do Continental knitting in this guide, but for all the other tutorials I show, it'll be in the English method. I'll link many other guides to Continental knitting in the description box below that I think are great resources for learning. There are many different ways to cast on to start your knitting project, but in this guide, we'll go over two simple ones that anyone can learn quickly: the wrap cast on and the long tail cast on. The wrap cast on is incredibly easy and perfect for beginners who are just starting out. To do a wrap cast on, the first thing you're going to do is create a slip knot by taking your yarn with both hands and push them towards each other, which will form a loop at the top. You're then going to grab the bottom of the loop with one hand, and with your other hand, insert your fingers into the loop and pull the yarn strand through. Then with your hand that's holding the bottom of the loop, gently pull down as your other hand pulls the loop up, which will tighten the knot at the bottom and create the slip knot. You can then slip your needle into the slip knot and then gently pull the strands to make the slip knot secured on your needle. To cast on, all you're going to do is take the strand that's connected to the ball of yarn and wrap it clockwise around your thumb. Then take your needle and push it under the strand that's wrapped under your thumb so that the needle and your thumb are in the same little loop together. Then lastly, slip your thumb out of the way and pull the strand connected to your ball of yarn, which will secure that loop onto the needle. And that's a wrap cast on. This is one of the easiest cast ons you can do as a beginner. The long tail cast on is another popular cast on method that gives you a nice semi-stretchy cast on for your projects. For the wrap cast on I showed earlier, all you had to do was create a slip knot and begin casting on. But for the long tail cast on, you need to first measure out how much yarn you'll need for the specific amount of cast ons you want to do. To figure out how much yarn you need to do the long tail cast on, first choose a number of stitches you'll need. For this example, I'll use 40 stitches. What you'll do is take the yarn end and move it up a bit, leaving maybe 2 to 3 inches of a tail. Then wrap the yarn around your needle 10 times. Then pick up the part where the last wrap ended. That's how long it needs to be for 10 stitches, plus a tail. To get to 40, just bend the yarn until the end hits the other part of the yarn and keep doing that 3 more times. At the end, you'll have how long the tail needs to be for 40 stitches. You can also guesstimate like I do, but it's better to guess and have a lot of yarn at the end than not enough. After you have that figured out, you can now make your slip knot. To do so, just grab the yarn with both hands and push it together, which will form a loop. Then put your fingers inside the loop and pull the yarn through. Insert one needle into that loop and tighten the bottom by pulling both of the ends, and you have your slip knot. To cast on your stitches, take the tail side of your yarn, which is the yarn that isn't connected to the ball, and loop it around your thumb clockwise. Then take your needle and push it into that loop on your thumb so the needle and your thumb are both in the same loop together. Then with your other hand, take the yarn that's connected to the ball and wrap it counterclockwise behind the needle that's in the loop with your thumb. Then push the loop on your thumb over the needle and pull the tail end of the yarn to create your cast on stitch. This cast on method is my personal favorite to do and the one I use the most for my projects. In order to knit, you'll have to work into the cast on stitches on your needle. There's essentially 2 loops for each stitch on your needle. The front loop is the side that's facing you and the back loop is the side behind it. When facing the front loop is on the left and the back loop is on the right. Also, the needle you use to work on the project is called your working needle, and the needle that holds your stitches is the holding needle. So to create a knit stitch, you're going to push your working needle into the front loop from the bottom to make an almost X shape. Then you're going to take the yarn that's attached to your ball and wrap it around the working needle counterclockwise. Holding onto your needle and yarn, you're going to push the working needle and the loop you just made under the loop which brings the yarn and working needle in front of the holding needle. Push the working needle up and slide the yarn with it, which will create a loop on the working needle. And that's a knit stitch English style. Usually with the first knit stitch, it'll be loose and the yarn tail will be in the way, but just tighten up your work by pulling the working yarn, then ignore the tail and continue knitting. After the second knit stitch, you can pull the tail to tighten it up more. In order to knit Continental style, you're first going to figure out the most comfortable way to hold your yarn. If you're someone who crochets, this might be easier for you as you can just hold your yarn the way you usually do. The way I hold my yarn is by first wrapping the yarn over my ring finger, under my middle, over my index, and then down towards my palm so my thumb and middle fingers can hold onto the yarn and the needle. If you want a tighter tension or grip on the yarn, you can wrap it around your index finger twice. You're going to push your working needle into the front loop from the bottom to make an almost X shape. You're then going to use your index finger to wrap the yarn over the working needle clockwise. You can use your opposite hand to adjust the yarn onto the working needle or to hold it in place if you need to. Then push the working needle and the loop you just made under the front loop, which brings the yarn and working needle in front of the holding needle. Push the working needle up and slide the yarn with it, which will create a loop on the working needle. And that's a knit stitch Continental style. A tip for this one is to not hold the loops so close to the edge, because if you do, they'll slip off while you're working on them and it'll just get annoying. So just keep them not too far down but not too close. To purl with the English method, first make sure your working yarn is in front. When knitting, it has to be in the back, but for purling, it has to be in the front. First, take your working needle and insert it into the front loop of the first stitch from top to bottom, which makes a sort of wide X shape. Then take the working yarn and wrap it around the working needle counterclockwise. Slide the working needle and the loop you just made down and under the front loop and push the working needle to the back, and then slide the first stitch off the holding needle, which completes your first purl stitch. You can pull your yarn to slightly tighten the stitch before moving on to the next stitch. To purl with the Continental method, first hold your yarn the same way as you did for the Continental knit stitch. Then push your working needle into the front loop of the first stitch from top to bottom, making sure the working yarn is in front of the working needle. For knitting, the yarn is always in the back, but for purling, the yarn is always in the front. Use your index finger to wrap the yarn over the working needle counterclockwise. Then take your middle finger and push the yarn strand down a bit before taking your needle and pushing it and the loop you just made under the front loop. Then push the loop off the holding needle and you just made a purl stitch. This one's very tricky because if you don't use your middle finger to kind of hold the yarn down, the yarn just won't cooperate and you won't be able to complete the purl stitch. So I like to use my middle finger to just slightly hold it down and then find a little space to push my working needle into the front loop so I can get it off the needle and move on with my project. It's incredibly easy to tell the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch. When working, a knit stitch will have sort of a V-shaped stitch under the loop you're about to work into. If it's a purl stitch, it'll have a knot-looking stitch under the loop you're about to work into. If you're looking at a finished piece, it's exactly the same. The knit stitches look like V's, and the purl stitches look like knots or bar stitches. There are many ways to cast off in knitting, but to do a basic cast off, all you have to do is first knit the first 2 stitches of the row. Then with your holding needle, you're going to push it under the first stitch on the working needle from the bottom and pull it over the second stitch so that there's only 1 stitch on the working needle remaining. Then you're going to knit the next stitch. And again, take your holding needle and pull the first stitch over the second stitch and off the working needle. Continue to do this until there is 1 stitch remaining. At the end of the row, with the 1 stitch remaining, you're going to take your yarn and wrap it clockwise around your thumb. Then you're going to insert your working needle into that loop by your thumb from the bottom, remove your thumb, and then pull the yarn to tighten. You can use your fingers to pull the first stitch over the second stitch and off the working needle. Then take your scissors and cut a bit of a tail and then pull the needle up to secure the row. And that's how you cast off. Depending on which stitches you choose to use, whether it be a knit stitch or a purl stitch, you can create an array of different designs and patterns in your project. Here are some of the basic variations you can create. To create a garter stitch, all you have to do is knit down the entire row. After, you're going to turn your project, and on the next row, repeat knitting until the end. Doing this over and over gives you the garter stitch, and it'll look like this. Here are some project examples with the garter stitch to get an idea of what it looks like. Another way to remember that it's a garter stitch is by thinking the stitches look like little ocean waves. There are many different variations of the rib stitch, but here I'll show you the two basic methods you can work for any project. The basic rib stitch is basically alternating between knit and purl stitches, which creates a ribbing effect. Before you work a rib stitch for your specific project, you want to make sure you have enough stitches for the rib stitch you're going to do. So if you're doing a 1x1 rib stitch, which is basically doing one knit stitch and then one purl stitch, and then repeating that back and forth. You want to make sure you have a cast on amount that's divisible by 2. That way, when you get to the end of the row, it can be a purl stitch and the rib section of your project can be even. If you're going to do the 2x2 rib, which is basically doing 2 knit stitches, and then 2 purl stitches, and then alternating between the two. You want to make sure that the cast on amount you do is divisible by 4 so that it can be even. You can even stretch these rib stitches out or make your own variations, like doing 3 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches, or 4 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. Just make sure the math is mathing and everything will be even. Here are some project examples with the rib stitch to get an idea of what it looks like. Usually the rib stitch is used on the collar, the arms, and the bottom of a sweater project. The stockinette stitch is the universal stitch used on knit projects. It's what you usually see on clothes at the store, even on your t-shirts and tank tops if you look really close. To do the stockinette stitch, first work the first row in all knit stitches. Then at the end of the row, turn your work and then work all purl stitches. Repeat working 1 knit row and then 1 purl row back and forth, which will give you the stockinette stitch. The knit rows will be on the front of the project and the purl rows will be on the back of the project. If you wanted to do a reverse stockinette stitch, all you would have to do is on the right side of the project, work all purl stitches, then on the wrong side of the project, work all knit stitches. Then the front of the project will look like this with the purl stitches, and the back will look like this with the knit stitches. Here are some project examples with stockinette stitch to get an example of what it looks like. Majority of knit projects you see are done with stockinette stitch or have some sort of variation of stockinette stitch involved. To create a seed stitch, all you have to do is for the first row, alternate between working a knit stitch and a purl stitch. So first, knit the first stitch, then purl the second stitch, then repeat that until the end of the row. At the end of the row, turn your work, and then instead of starting with the knit stitch, you're going to start with a purl stitch. The seed stitch is when you do the opposite of the stitch you see. The first stitch of the row is a knit stitch, so you're going to purl it instead. Then the next stitch is supposed to be a purl, but you're going to knit it instead, then repeat this down the row. On the third row, you're going to repeat this. So the beginning of the row starts with a purl, but instead you're going to knit it. Then the next stitch is a knit stitch, but instead you're going to purl it. Doing this back and forth will give you the seed stitch. Here are some project examples with the seed stitch to get an idea of what it looks like. The cable knit is where you twist the stitches either behind or in front of each other to create these beautiful cables in your project. To do this, you can use a cable needle or anything you can hold stitches on, like a bobby pin, a regular pin, or highlighter, or even another set of needles. There are many different types of cable twists, but I'm going to show you the basic 4 cable. For the area where I'll be adding a cable twist, I like to do 4 stitches of reverse stockinette stitch just so that the cable twists can really pop out. So I'm going to first purl the first 4 stitches of the row. For a 4 cable twist, you're going to take your cable needle or pin or whatever you want to use and slide half of the stitches off your holding needle and onto the cable needle. So since we're doing a 4 cable twist, half of 4 is 2, so slide 2 stitches off your needle and onto the cable needle. Then you can either choose to hold it to the front of the project or hold it to the back of the project. If you hold it to the front, your cable twist will lean to the left. If you hold it to the back, your cable twist will lean to the right. For this example, I'll hold it to the back. Then you're going to knit the next 2 stitches that are on the holding needle. After, take your cable needle and use that to knit the 2 stitches that you held to the front or back. And that was the start of your cable twist. After the cable twist, I added 4 reverse stockinette stitches just like I did at the start, so I went ahead and purled the next 4 stitches. At the end of the row, turn your work. On the wrong side of the project, you're going to work the stitches how you see them. So for the reverse stockinette stitches I did, it shows that they are knit stitches, so I'm going to knit those 4 stitches. Then on the back of the cable twist, it shows they are purl stitches. The cable twist is a stockinette stitch, but it's just twisted, so you're going to treat it like a stockinette stitch. So purl the 4 stitches of the cable twist. It'll feel weird and the gap will look large, but that will even out later as you continue to work on the cable twist. On the 3rd row, you're going to work down normally following the stitches as they're shown. So for the reverse stockinette stitches, I'm going to purl them since they're showing me purl stitches. Then for the cable twist, you're going to knit them normally with no twist since you don't have to twist for every row. The choice of when to twist is up to you, but for a 4 cable twist, I like to twist on every 4th row. So if I first twisted on row 1, I'll twist again on row 5 and then again on row 9. This is what I look for if I lose count or just want a visual reminder of when to twist. The twist will look pretty flat, and on the following row, I'll just go ahead and twist it. When you're reading a pattern and it says something like C4B or C8F, it means cable 4 back or cable 8 front, which is basically just saying that it's a cable that uses 4 stitches and is twisted either in the front or the back. Here are some project examples with the cable twist to get an idea of what it looks like. If you're working with any of these stitches and forget which row you're working on, then don't worry. You can easily figure out how many rows you've done so far by looking closely at the stitches. For stockinette stitch, it has these V-looking stitches, which are the knit stitches. Each V counts as 1 stitch, and if you count them vertically, then you can tell how many rows you've done so far. For reverse stockinette stitch, you first want to find the stitches that look like upside down U's or the ones that have a rainbow shape to them. If you count each of those up vertically, that will tell you how many rows you have. For rib stitch, it's the same as the stockinette stitch method. Just count the V's vertically, which can tell you how many rows you've done so far for the ribbing. For garter stitch, there are these bumps that look like rainbows or upside down U's. All you have to do is count those up vertically and then multiply that number by 2. So for this swatch, I have 6 rainbows, which means I did 12 rows of garter stitch. For seed stitch, all you have to do is find 1 column of the little purl bumps that stick out, then count those up vertically. Once you have that number, just multiply it by 2 and you have the amount of rows that you did. For this swatch, I have 7 bumps, so that means I did 14 rows of seed stitch. Some projects are worked continuously in the round, and to join your project in the round, you could either use the magic loop method or the double pointed needles method. I personally haven't tried the double pointed needles method yet, but I'll link an amazing tutorial for it in the description box below. For the circular needles method, you first want to make sure you have a cord length that's small enough to be able to push all your needles around to both sides of both needles like so. That way you can easily work in the round. I'd recommend this method if you have interchangeable needles so you can easily choose a smaller cord without changing your needles completely. To actually join in the round, first make sure all the stitches are facing the same way with the cast on edge facing inward so that they aren't twisted. Then cast on one extra stitch onto your working needle. Take your working needle and insert it into the first stitch as if to purl and slip it onto the working needle. Then take your holding needle and take the stitch below the stitch we just added onto the working needle and pull it over the first stitch to remove it. Then slip the first stitch on the working needle back onto the holding needle. Use your hand to pull both tails of yarn to tighten up the gap in the middle, and once it looks cleaner, your stitches have been joined in the round and is ready to be knit. It's important to use the stitch marker to mark where the beginning of the row is, as it's a bit hard to tell when working in the round. One important thing to note is that when working in the round, there's no turning your work, so if you're working stockinette stitch for an example, all you'd have to do is knit in the round. There wouldn't be any purl rows. For the magic loop method, you would also use circular needles, but this method doesn't require a certain cable length, which makes it perfect if you have needles that aren't interchangeable. To do the magic loop method, first push your stitches into the middle of your cord. Then split your stitches evenly in the middle and push each side of the stitches onto each needle by pulling the cord through the middle of the stitches. Make sure all the stitches are even and the ends of it are facing each other in the middle. To join them in the round, take one stitch from the top of the holding needle and place it on the working needle. Then take the second stitch of the working needle, pull it over the first stitch, and then place it on the holding needle. And now the magic loop is created. It should look like a rectangle. To start working on your project, pull your working needle out until the cord is slightly hanging out. Then start knitting like normal. Once you finish all the stitches on one side, pull the cord to bring the needle through the second set of stitches. Then pull the working needle out again and continue knitting. Here are some projects that were worked in the round. I honestly love working in the round just to avoid having to constantly turn my work. An increase is just adding stitches to your project to make it grow bigger, and there's lots of ways to do this in knitting. Here I'll show you a few ways in the English style. A yarn over increase is probably the easiest way to increase, and for the English method, all you're going to do is wrap the working yarn around your needle as if to knit, and then work a knit stitch. And then when you're done, you'll have an extra stitch on your needle. To do a yarn over increase on a purl row English style, all you have to do is first make sure that the working yarn is in front of the working needle. Then wrap the working yarn counterclockwise around the working needle, making sure it falls in the front again. Then purl normally. Now you have a yarn over increase on a purl row. A make one left and a make one right is basically just a regular increase, but one leans to the left and one leans to the right. The way they lean either to the left or the right is based on the middle stitch you use to increase. If you work into it from the front, it leans to the left, and if you work into it from the back, it leans to the right. To make an increase that leans to the left, use your holding needle to pick up the middle strand of the yarn that's in between the two stitches and pick it up from the front and onto the needle. This makes the strand lean to the left. Then take your working needle and push it into the stitch from top to bottom, but in the back leg of the stitch. Then knit normally. To make an increase that leans to the right, use your holding needle to lift up the strand that's in the middle of the 2 stitches from the back. This makes the strand of yarn lean to the right. After, knit into that stitch normally. To make an increase that leans to the left on a purl row, use your holding needle to pick up the middle strand of yarn that's in between the 2 stitches and pick it up from the front and onto the needle. This makes the strand of yarn lean to the left. Then purl it normally. To make an increase that leans to the right on the purl row, use your holding needle to pick up the middle strand of yarn that's in between the 2 stitches and pick it up from the back and onto the needle. This makes the strand of yarn lean to the right. Then push your needle into the front leg of the stitch and purl normally. When you continue to do these increases, you'll end up with a project that is gradually growing wider to whichever side you decided to do, whether it be to the right or to the left. To do a bar increase, all you're going to do is take your working needle and work a normal knit stitch. At the end of the knit stitch, don't take it off your needle, but instead push your working needle into the back loop of the stitch and then create another knit stitch. Doing this creates a little increase that looks like a bar. To do a bar increase on a purl row, first purl the stitch normally, but don't take it off your needles. You're going to take your working needle and push it into the back loop of the stitch from bottom to top, making sure it crosses in the front of the holding needle. Then purl again normally. This increase is the one I use the most, but you have to choose where you want it to be specifically if you don't want the bar stitches that come from it making your project look differently from how you want it to. A decrease is when you knit stitches together to make a project smaller. Some of them will lean to the left and some of them will lean to the right. To create a right leaning decrease, you'll do a knit 2 together, which is just taking your working needle and pushing it into 2 stitches before knitting normally. And that's all it is. To create a right leaning decrease but on a purl row, all you have to do is insert your working needle purlwise into 2 stitches. Then purl them together normally. And that's it. To create a left leaning decrease, you'll do a slip slip knit. First, take your working needle and place it into the stitch as if to knit. Instead of knitting, just slip the first stitch onto the working needle. Do the same for the second stitch. Doing this twists the stitches slightly as it goes onto your needles. If you can see on the holding needle, these stitches are leaning towards the left naturally, but after slipping them onto the working needle, they twisted and are facing to the right. You're then going to take your holding needle and insert it into the front of those 2 stitches to form an X. Then knit normally. To create a left leaning decrease on a purl row, all you have to do is take your working needle and insert it into the first stitch as if to knit, but instead of knitting, all you're going to do is slip it onto the working needle. Do the same for the second stitch. Then you're going to take your holding needle and insert it into the front of both of the stitches, then slip those 2 stitches back onto the needle. The reason we moved them in the first place is to make them twist a bit. After, take your working needle and insert it into the back loops of both of the stitches from bottom to top, making sure that the working needle is crossing in the front of the holding needle. Then purl normally. To change colors in the beginning of your work, all you're going to do is insert your working needle into the first stitch as if to knit. Then take your new color and loop it onto the working needle. With your new color, finish off that first knit stitch. Then continue knitting with your new color. If you're switching colors in the middle of your work, first insert your working needle as if to knit. Then take your new color and loop it onto the working needle. Then knit normally and continue working. On the second row, once you reach the gap changing the colors created, you're going to continue working as if it's not there. After a few rows, I recommend tying the strands of yarn from the first color and the second color in a gentle knot so the gap doesn't show. Then you can weave in those tails later. If you're switching colors on a purl row, it's exactly the same. First, insert your working needle into the stitch as if to purl, and then take your new color and loop it onto the working needle. Then finish that purl stitch and continue working on your project. It's the same as well if you're switching colors in the middle of the project. When you're done with a project, you'll most likely have tails that hang out like this. To get rid of them, take your tapestry needle and insert one of the tails into it. Then in the back of the project, take your tapestry needle and insert it into the back of one of the bar stitches in the back. You're then going to repeat this but diagonally, making sure to gently weave in the tails like so. Then if you check in the front of the project, you won't see the tail showing at all. If you weave your tail in just by going into the stitches straight forward, you'll easily be able to see it in the front. So I recommend you weave your tail in diagonally. And once it's weaved in, just cut the excess yarn from the tail and your project is done. If you want to attach two knit pieces together from the sides, all you have to do is take a tapestry needle and a long scrap piece of yarn and first work into the outermost bottom quarter of your first piece. Then do the same for the second piece. Now you're going to look into the stitch above where you attached your yarn in the first piece and look for the V-stitch. In each V-stitch, there's a little bar in the middle of it. You're going to insert your tapestry needle into that bar stitch and pull your yarn through. Then for the second piece, you're going to do the exact same thing and look for that bar stitch and then insert your tapestry needle and pull your yarn through. If you continue to do this back and forth, your two pieces will attach together like this. This is called the vertical seam. If you want to attach the two pieces together from the top, take your tapestry needle and a scrap piece of yarn and work into both legs of the V-stitch on your first piece like so. Then do the same for the second piece. Now go back to your first piece and work into the next set of V-legs and pull your yarn through. Then on the second piece, go into the next set of V-legs and do this as well. If you work back and forth alternating between the pieces, you'll get this result making both of the pieces attached together. This is called the mattress stitch. If for whatever reason you make a mistake and have to go back to a row that you've already done, all you have to do is take out your needles and gently pull the yarn, which will remove the stitches. Once you remove the mistake, gently take your time and insert your needles back into the stitches. Sometimes doing this will cause the stitches to drop, so be careful when adding your needles as it'll pull the stitches easily. If you want to remove your needles to use for another project or to measure or try on your piece, simply take a long piece of scrap yarn and use a tapestry needle to sew it through your stitches. Then you can remove your needles and do what you need to do. When you're ready to add your needles back to the project, simply add them back in, remove the scrap yarn, and it'll be as if nothing happened. If for some reason one of your stitches falls off the needle and starts to unravel, you don't have to panic. This is actually incredibly easy to fix. All you'll need is a crochet hook, or if the stitches are large enough, you can just use your own hand. Take your hook or fingers and insert it into the stitch that's still intact. Then go behind the stitch above it and pull it through the stitch. Again, go behind the stitch above the stitch on your hook or finger and pull it through the stitch. Keep working all the way up with the same technique. And once you're on the last stitch, place it onto the holding needle and it'll be as if nothing happened. Sometimes when you add stitches back onto your needle, they might twist, and you can tell that it's twisted by the resistance it gives when you try to work into it. All you have to do to fix this is take the stitch off your needle and place it back onto the needle in the opposite direction. Now you can easily work into the stitch and continue your project. In a separate guide, I'm going to go over all of the information that you'll need to begin knitting your own clothing from scratch, but for now, here are some easy projects that you can begin knitting with the skills that you've learned in this guide. With your new knitting skills, you can create knit scarves, whether it be with stockinette stitch, garter stitch, or rib stitch. You can even combine stockinette and rib stitch to make a fun border on the bottom of the scarf. You can create hand warmers by knitting them flat and then using the mattress stitch or the vertical seam to stitch them together, making sure to leave out a little hole for your thumb. You can even knit your own leg warmers, which I already have an in-depth guide for. You can create cute little square coasters or washcloths to use. You can create your own throw blankets with seed stitch or even table mats. If you want to take it a step forward and challenge yourself, you can make yourself a patchwork cardigan, which can be made by knitting individual squares and then sewing them together after in the form of a cardigan. You've officially reached the end of this guide. I hope it was incredibly helpful, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comments below and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Squarespace is an all-in-one platform where you can create your very own website. I think it's perfect if you're someone who wants to open their own fiber arts business, whether if it's to sell your own pieces, open commissions, or even sell your own patterns. You can even use it to showcase your portfolio for your art as well. Squarespace offers numerous amounts of templates to get you started, and the designer interface is beginner-friendly and customizable, so your website can look however you'd prefer. If you wanted to create your own business website, Squarespace offers a commerce tool which allows you to keep track of your inventory and your customer data. And you can even make cute newsletters, which is really fun. If you're interested in Squarespace, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and you can use my code for 10% off of your first purchase. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.